I'm a 33-year-old guy, and to say my relationship with my dad is complicated would be an understatement. Growing up, my dad was more of a visitor than a parent. My mom was the one holding everything together, working 2 jobs most of the time while my dad lived like a carefree bachelor. He wasn't completely out of the picture, but his contributions were sporadic at best, buying me a toy here, showing up to a soccer game there, but never fully committing to being a parent. My mom, on the other hand, was relentless. She worked mornings as a waitress and evenings cleaning offices. I still remember her coming home late at night, her hands raw from scrubbing floors, just so she could put food on the table. My brother and I didn't have much, but she always made sure we had what we needed. My dad? Let's just say he wasn't the type to sacrifice his comfort for anyone else's. One memory stands out like a neon sign in my mind. It was my junior year of college, and I was on the verge of being kicked out because I couldn't pay $1,000 in tuition. Desperate, I called my dad, explaining how I had been working part-time and just needed this one push to stay in school. His response? "You should have planned better." That was it. No apology, no offer to help. I hung up the phone, feeling utterly lost. Then, like she always did, my mom saved the day. She sold her car, the only reliable vehicle we had, to cover my tuition. I don't know how she managed to get to her jobs after that, but she didn't complain. She just smiled and said, "You better make this count." That moment solidified my decision. I would never depend on my dad again. Fast forward to now. I've worked my way up in my career, hit 6 figures last year, own a modest house, and drive a decent car. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm standing on solid ground. I've even been in therapy, working through a lot of the resentment I've carried toward my dad. But just when I thought I could leave it all behind, he showed up. The call. It started with a phone call. My dad, now 65 and retired, told me he couldn't afford his rent anymore. He was calm about it, almost casual, as if he were asking me to grab a cup of coffee. He wanted to move in with me, just for a while. He didn't provide many details, just that he was struggling and needed my help. I told him I'd think about it. That night, I called my brother to get his take. "Don't let him in," my brother said bluntly. "You'll never get him out." He reminded me of all the times our dad had let us down, how he never paid child support on time, how he skipped my high school graduation to go on a fishing trip, how he spent money on his girlfriend's kids while we scraped by. "He's a leech," my brother said. "You don't owe him anything." Still, I couldn't shake the guilt. He's my dad, after all. Then came the bombshell. My dad told me, "It's payback time. I raised you, now it's your turn to take care of me." That sentence hit me like a truck. I thought about all the nights my mom cried because she didn't know how we'd make rent, all the birthdays he missed, all the times I needed him and he wasn't there. And now he was asking me for help? The fallout. To make things worse, my dad aired our dirty laundry on Facebook. He posted a rant about how his ungrateful kids were abandoning him in his old age, painting himself as the victim. The comment section blew up, half the people sided with him, while the other half tore him apart. My phone started blowing up with messages from relatives and friends. Some said I should forgive him and let him move in. Others said I owed him nothing. Even my therapist didn't give me a clear answer. She said this was a chance for me to set boundaries and decide what kind of relationship I wanted with my dad. But setting boundaries with someone who ignores them feels like putting up a fence in a hurricane. It's going to get blown away. My mom, as always, was supportive. She told me to do whatever brought me peace. But even she seemed conflicted. She knows better than anyone what my dad is like, but I think part of her still feels bad for him. Family dinner. After my dad's Facebook rant gained traction, my brother suggested we have a family dinner to address everything. I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but I agreed. We met at a local restaurant with a private dining room. My dad showed up looking disheveled, leaning heavily on a cane. He played up his frailty in a way I hadn't seen before. Once we ordered food, my dad launched into a monologue about how hard life had been for him. He claimed his landlord raised his rent, his retirement checks weren't enough, and he had no one else to turn to. He painted himself as a martyr, someone who had always done his best but was dealt a bad hand in life. My brother didn't let him get far. Calmly but firmly, he said, "If you want help, you need to own up to how you got here." That's when my brother dropped a bombshell. My dad had gambled away a large portion of his retirement savings. He had been a regular at a casino for years, and when the money ran out, he started borrowing from friends and relatives. My mom backed him up, adding stories of her own. How my dad drained their joint account for frivolous purchases, left her scrambling to pay bills, and consistently neglected his responsibilities. When my dad tried to blame us, I finally spoke up. I told him I wasn't ready to make a decision about him moving in and that I wouldn't be guilt-tripped into rushing it. That's when he snapped. He slammed his hand on the table, called me ungrateful, and stormed out. Where I stand. My therapist encouraged me to look into affordable senior living options as a way to set boundaries without cutting my dad off completely. Meanwhile, a distant relative reached out, warning me not to let him move in, saying he had taken advantage of them in the past. Through it all, my dad's Facebook posts continue, painting me as the villain. It's added to my stress, but my close friends remind me that setting boundaries isn't wrong. Even with all the support I've received, I can't help but feel conflicted. But deep down, I know I have to draw the line somewhere. This is just the beginning. Update 2, edited. After the disastrous family dinner, I decided to spend the weekend at my mom's place to escape the chaos. She lives in a small but cozy apartment, filled with knickknacks and photo frames that tell the story of her sacrifices over the years. While we were catching up over coffee in her kitchen, I noticed a worn leather journal tucked away on a shelf. It looked out of place among the cookbooks and piles of mail, so I asked her about it. My mom hesitated for a moment before handing it to me. She said it was something she'd kept during the rough years when my brother and I were kids. Curious, I flipped through the pages, not expecting much. What I found stopped me cold. It wasn't just a journal, it was a record of every time my dad had let us down, every choice he'd made that left us struggling. There were entries about him spending their rent money on a new stereo system and notes about how he'd promised to help pay for school supplies, only to back out because he forgot he needed new tires for his car. One page stood out in particular. My mom had written about the day she sold her car to pay my college tuition. She wrote that my dad had the money to help but refused out of spite, saying I needed to learn responsibility. Reading those words felt like a punch to the gut. I took the journal home and brought it up in my next therapy session. My therapist encouraged me to process what I'd read without jumping to conclusions, but it was hard to stay neutral. The journal painted a clear picture of someone who had the means to help but consistently chose not to. It wasn't just neglect, it felt calculated, as if he had made an art form out of avoiding responsibility. As if on cue, my dad's girlfriend reached out the following day. She sent me a long text saying I needed to get over the past and do the right thing by letting my dad move in. She claimed he was too proud to ask anyone else for help, which didn't add up considering the number of people he'd already hit up for money. The message ended with a plea to remember that family comes first, ironic, given my dad's track record. That evening, I got a voicemail from my dad. He said he needed an answer by the end of the week and that I should remember where I came from. It wasn't hard to figure out what he meant, but it only added to the pressure. I called my brother to vent, and for the first time, he shared some of his own stories. He told me about times our dad had borrowed money from him, promising to pay it back but never following through. He mentioned how their relationship had been rocky ever since our dad skipped his wedding to go on a fishing trip. Hearing these things made me feel less alone in my frustrations but also deepened my resolve not to cave. The journal started to shift opinions within the family. My mom decided to share some of its contents with a few relatives, and suddenly, people who had been siding with my dad started backing off. It didn't take long for one of them to contact me with another revelation: my dad still had gambling debts. They sent me screenshots of messages where he'd asked for loans, promising to pay them back after a lucky streak that clearly never came. Things took an unexpected turn when my dad decided to drag my workplace into the mess. I got a call from HR, who let me know he'd emailed them, claiming I was neglecting family duties and painting himself as a helpless retiree. Thankfully, my employer saw through his tactics and offered their support, even providing resources for dealing with harassment. It was embarrassing, but it also reinforced my decision to keep firm boundaries. As always, my mom stood by me. She told me not to let guilt cloud my judgment, reminding me of all the times she had to choose between keeping the peace and standing up for herself. She said she'd spent too many years sacrificing for someone who never prioritized her or their kids and didn't want me to make the same mistake. To cover all my bases, I consulted a lawyer. They confirmed that I wasn't legally obligated to support my dad, which was a relief. At the same time, I started noticing that my dad's behavior was alienating even more family members. He'd been asking everyone he could for money, and his desperation was starting to wear thin. Meanwhile, my Reddit post had gone viral. The comments section was split. Some people argued that family comes first, no matter what, while others shared their own stories of cutting off toxic parents. It was eye-opening to see how many people were dealing with similar situations, and their advice helped me start to see things more clearly. I realized that every choice I made needed to be about protecting my peace. My dad's actions had put him in this position, and it wasn't my job to fix it. For the first time in a while, I felt like I was gaining some clarity. Update 3, edited. It started with a phone call from the hospital. My dad had been admitted after what they described as a minor health scare. The nurse on the line didn't go into details but mentioned chest pain and high blood pressure. She assured me he was stable but said I should come by to discuss his situation. I debated whether to go, but my brother insisted on coming along. He knows how to pull strings, my brother said, warning me to tread carefully. I knew exactly what he meant. When we arrived, my dad was in a shared room, propped up on a pillow and hooked to a heart monitor. He looked older than I remembered, thinner too. He greeted me with a weak smile and said, "I knew you'd come." Then he launched into a detailed recounting of his ordeal, how he'd been feeling lightheaded, thought he might be having a heart attack, and was terrified he wouldn't make it. It was dramatic, but the nurse's earlier tone told me it wasn't as dire as he made it seem. Predictably, the conversation shifted to his living situation. He wanted to know if I'd made a decision. "This could happen again," he said, gesturing toward the machines. "I need to be with family." He reminded me that family sticks together and threw in a line about how I'd regret it if I turned him away and something happened to him. It felt less like a conversation and more like a guilt trip on steroids. While we were there, something unexpected happened. One of his ex-girlfriends from years ago showed up to check on him. At first, she didn't recognize me, but she eventually put two and two together. As we chatted, she let a few things slip about their time together, specifically how reckless he'd been with money. She laughed about how he used to max out his credit cards on nonsense like expensive dinners and gadgets he didn't need, and how she'd had to cover the bills more than once. "He's always been creative with finances," she said, not realizing how much her words confirmed everything I'd been discovering. Later that evening, his current girlfriend sent me a long text. She claimed she couldn't take him in because her lease didn't allow additional tenants. She framed it as if she was heartbroken about the situation but kept emphasizing that it was now my turn to step up. She even suggested that I should be grateful for the chance to support him. It felt more like a sales pitch than a genuine request. In my next therapy session, my therapist suggested writing a pros and cons list about letting my dad move in. It felt almost trivial given everything that had happened, but I gave it a try. Unsurprisingly, the cons far outweighed the pros. The biggest one? Financial ruin. I'd recently learned my dad had thousands of dollars in unpaid debts. One of his friends, who had loaned him money years ago, casually mentioned how my dad had never repaid him. He hinted that if my dad moved in, he'd likely expect me to help him with those debts. Meanwhile, my mom added another piece to the puzzle. She told me about a time when my dad emptied their joint savings account to buy a motorcycle. This was back when my brother and I were kids, and we needed money for school supplies. My mom had to borrow from a neighbor just to get us the basics. Hearing these stories solidified the picture of someone who never thought twice about his responsibilities. My brother also opened up about his own experiences, revealing that our dad had been asking him for money for years, using similar guilt and manipulation tactics. My brother had always refused, but the constant harassment had taken a toll on him. As if that weren't enough, my dad's Facebook posts were still gaining traction. More family members started reaching out, either to offer support or to shame me. The tipping point came when I overheard my dad talking to a nurse during one of my visits. He didn't realize I was standing just outside the curtain. He was joking about how, once he moved in with me, he could sell my house and use the money to finally enjoy retirement. I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. This wasn't just about having a roof over his head, he had plans for my life, my home, my finances. And none of those plans involved asking what I wanted or needed. By the time I left the hospital that day, my decision was clear. Letting him move in wasn't just a bad idea, it would be a disaster. It was evident that if I allowed this to happen, I'd lose not just my autonomy, but everything I'd worked so hard to build. Update 4. After overhearing my dad's plan to sell my house and enjoy retirement, I knew it was time to set firm boundaries. But before I could act, my dad escalated things. He left me a voicemail that started off calm but quickly turned into a rant. He said he was done waiting for my answer and that he would show up at my house by the weekend to settle this once and for all. It wasn't an outright threat, but the tone made it clear he expected me to cave. I forwarded the voicemail to my brother, who immediately stepped in. He offered to take over all communication with our dad to take the pressure off me. I gratefully agreed. That night, my brother called him to lay out some ground rules, but things didn't go as planned. Our dad accused him of ganging up on him and refused to back down from his plan to show up at my house. Sure enough, that Saturday, just as I was leaving for a friend's birthday party, he arrived. He banged on my front door like it was an emergency. I didn't answer, hoping he'd go away. But he didn't. Instead, he started yelling for me to let him in, claiming I was hiding and too cowardly to face him. It was a scene. I ended up calling the police, not something I ever thought I'd have to do with my own father. When they arrived, they defused the situation, convincing him to leave. But the encounter left me shaken. After that, I consulted a lawyer again, just to ensure I was fully protected. They advised me to issue a formal no-contact letter, which I did. It wasn't an easy decision, but it felt like the only way to protect myself from further harassment. In the days that followed, more family members reached out. Some were supportive, understanding the impossible situation I was in. Others criticized me, saying I was being cold and ungrateful. But for the first time, I didn't feel swayed by their opinions. I realized that I wasn't responsible for fixing my dad's mistakes or bailing him out of the consequences of his actions. Sometimes, protecting your peace means making hard decisions. And sometimes, the hardest decision is the one that finally sets you free. Final update. It's been a few months since everything went down, and I finally feel like I can breathe again. Looking back, it's hard to believe how much my life was consumed by my dad's demands and the fallout that followed. But now, I feel a sense of closure I never thought I'd have. After that Saturday, when I had to call the police, my decision to enforce strict boundaries solidified. I sent my dad a no-contact letter through my lawyer, making it clear that I wouldn't tolerate further harassment. It was a painful step to take, but it was necessary. Predictably, my dad didn't take it well. He tried reaching out through other family members, framing me as the villain and claiming I had abandoned him in his time of need. At first, some relatives echoed his sentiments, accusing me of being heartless. But the journal my mom shared had already shifted perspectives, and more people began distancing themselves from him as they pieced together the full story. Even his girlfriend eventually stopped advocating for him. I later learned she had been fed up with his behavior for years and only stayed out of obligation. She ended things shortly after I sent the no-contact letter, saying she couldn't keep enabling his lifestyle. Meanwhile, I focused on rebuilding my peace. Therapy became a lifeline during this time, helping me unpack years of guilt, manipulation, and resentment. My therapist helped me see that I wasn't abandoning my dad, I was simply refusing to sacrifice my well-being for someone who had consistently chosen not to take responsibility for his own life. My brother and I grew closer through this ordeal. For years, we had both been carrying the weight of our dad's behavior in silence, thinking we were the only ones dealing with his manipulation. Sharing our stories brought us a sense of solidarity, and we've made a pact to continue supporting each other as we move forward. As for my dad, the no-contact letter didn't stop him from trying to stir up drama online. His Facebook posts grew increasingly desperate, with wild claims about being cast aside by his own children. At one point, he even posted an old picture of me with a caption implying I'd promised to care for him in his old age. It was frustrating, but I decided not to engage. The truth was already out there, and I refused to let him drag me into another emotional battle. Eventually, his post stopped gaining traction. People started seeing through his tactics, especially after some of his financial requests to other relatives came to light. The gambling debts, the loans he never repaid, it all painted a clear picture of someone who had spent decades avoiding accountability. One of the most unexpected outcomes was the support I received from strangers online. My Reddit post had gone viral, and the comments were a mix of encouragement, shared experiences, and hard truths. Reading about others who had faced similar struggles helped me feel less alone, and their advice reinforced my decision to prioritize my own mental health. Today, my life feels calmer. The constant anxiety I used to feel, waiting for the next text, voicemail, or knock on the door, has faded. I've set boundaries not just with my dad but with anyone who tries to guilt me into compromising my peace. My mom, as always, has been my rock through this. She told me she's proud of me for standing up for myself, something she wishes she had done earlier in her own life. Hearing that meant more than I can put into words. This experience has taught me an important lesson: family isn't just about blood. It's about mutual respect, love, and support. And sometimes, the healthiest thing you can do is walk away from a relationship that only brings you pain. I don't know what the future holds for my dad. Part of me still wishes things could have been different, that he could have chosen to be the kind of parent we needed. But I've accepted that his choices are his own, and I no longer have to bear the weight of them. For the first time in a long time, I feel free. Story 2. AITA for refusing to be with my wife during childbirth or signing the birth certificate until she proves that the baby is mine and that she and my best friend didn't have an affair. My M44 wife Cynthia, F41, and I have been married for almost 15 years. I raised her older children as my own. We have 2 kids together and one that she just gave birth to, but I won't sign the birth certificate until I get a DNA test. Back in 2014, we had a huge crisis due to her infidelity. Her AP was her supervisor, and I only found out when she was abruptly fired and the company filed a case against her for allegations that I won't discuss here. Her supervisor was a co-defendant. She had to come clean about the whole thing, including having had an affair that lasted 2 years. I completely lost all trust in her. I requested paternity tests on our kids together, they are mine, got a lawyer, and moved out. I eventually forgave her and tried to move on because the pain of breaking up our family and not seeing the kids every day was unbearable. We had a very good run until now. Our relationship felt stronger. The sex was great, I felt like she was the woman that I fell in love with and was very happy that I gave us another chance. Years ago, her best friend Dana, F42, cut her off. They were friends since grade school, but Dana abruptly ended the friendship, changed her number, and even blocked me and our older kids everywhere. Cynthia expressed sadness about it for years and often talked about Dana like a true sister. When my wife got pregnant, with this last baby, she got very depressed about everything. Dana was our go-to person in case of emergency, so I thought maybe some type of closure would help. I managed to get Dana's contact information from a friend in common and asked if she would be willing to talk. To my surprise, she was interested. The conversation wasn't what I expected. She called me a flying monkey and said I ought to be ashamed for enabling my wife. She said she was absolutely fed up with Cynthia and that she abandoned the friendship because she got tired of feeling like a tool, always having to do favors and being generally at my wife's service. She said she was unable to share anything because my wife only talked about herself and that my wife failed to even thank her for gifts and other things, but kept raising the bar and asking for more and more stuff from her. Dana mentioned having attempted a slow fade, but my best friend Gary, M48, stepped in, and it put her off tremendously. I didn't know this. I didn't know that Gary was sent by my wife to talk Dana out of restricting their time together when her best friend became distant and that he pressured her and tried to force her to contact Cynthia, and that this resulted in a complaint against him because his messages became menacing and he hinted at sending her spyware. I know Gary can be intense but never like this. He works in IT, so the spyware part is not entirely impossible. Dana and Gary never had any contact prior to this. Dana cut everyone off out of distrust and because she did pursue a complaint against him with the authorities. She sent me evidence, the court case number, and receipts. I'm hurt because not only did he get in trouble for trying to help my wife, but he actually got into a serious situation, and it was kept a secret from me. I confronted him, and he said that he was just trying to help. I confronted my wife, and she said she was desperate because Dana had always been her main support system. This did it for me. I don't care how many times my wife says nothing else was going on, I have no way to erase the idea that they might be hiding other things. The fact that Cynthia managed to get Gary to do something that he knows is illegal and that he went too far trying to please her makes me wonder about things. Also, during our entire conversation, Dana insisted that Cynthia is a black hole of a person and that she was disgusted that not only my wife had been using her for years, but would not think anything of engaging third parties to enable herself to keep extracting benefits for whoever she wants. To make matters worse, I asked if she knew that my wife had cheated, and she said yes and that it played a part in her disowning her. I will not even be able to go back to talking with Dana because she made it clear that she wants nothing further. Back in the day, I thought Gary looked off, but when I asked, he said it was about him separating from his ex and that he was bummed out. I talked to Cynthia about it. I told her that I reached out to Dana and what she said. She looked horrified. We went over that for days until I couldn't take it anymore and asked if she and Gary had any time of inappropriate involvement. She reacted, angry, and seemed very offended. Also, now I feel that maybe her depression over Dana wasn't real. Maybe she wanted to use that so that I could accommodate her with whatever she wanted. I requested a paternity test on the baby, and she flat out said no. She threatened to divorce me. This is why I moved out weeks before she gave birth. I refused to drive her to the hospital or be at the birthing room. All I'm asking is for confirmation that it's my child and she isn't acting cooperative. She tried to deny Dana's complaint to the authorities, despite me offering evidence. Gary has apologized for keeping secrets, but he's denying ever sleeping with her. I'm anxious, but sometimes, I get very numb and wonder if I'm being crazy. I understand that Dana was very right to act the way that she did, but I have no evidence of cheating or an affair between Cynthia and Gary. This has affected my health, and sometimes I feel that the less I see or hear from Cynthia, the less chances to get an anxiety or panic attack. Obviously, my family knows that we are separated and are showing divided opinions. Some say that I was impulsive and that I'm jumping to conclusions. They didn't know about her cheating years ago. I'm not meeting the new baby until she can prove my paternity. She's having health issues related to post-birth. I'm present for my kids and haven't skipped on my duties, but told her to either have a relative come help her out or move to their place temporarily because I will not be helping her in any way until this is resolved. She says that I'm being abusive and that being alone in the maternity ward was humiliating. Ida? Edit 2. To add that Gary hasn't been proactive and is very silent. Edit 3, my wife says she won't agree to the DNA because I'm ruining our marriage.